Put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record and dance with me.
Put the needle on the record and what you hear, memories getting sparked in the sound of your ear. We're talking records about the records that spoke to us, but even mention records that have broke to us. But records is a crime, get the AF. Check out this episode, we're completely deaf. We're talking records. We're talking records. We're talking records. We're talking records. That's right.
Welcome, vinyl fans, new and old. From the freshly initiated to the old school veterans of the medium. We are your psychic medium betwixt the world of sonic sound and human emotion. That's right, it's time for another episode of Talkin' Records, the ongoing Iliad of memories and feels that remain with us to this very day in reference to audio recordings. Billy D, the Mater D of cutting and shredding, is on hand, and I, the vital one, is along here to discuss another episode of Talkin' Records. So, Bill, do we have enough computer love for this computer world? Let's pay tribute to the recently passed FLORIAN SCHNEIDER and get into today's episode where we cover and hit the execute button on Kraftwerk'S Computer World. All right, guys, so we're going to talk about Kraftwerk'S Computer World. It was released in May of 1981. How do you feel about that, Bill?
It's kind of hard for me to put that in perspective as to what was going on. We are old. Yeah, that was a long time ago. 81 is actually before I discovered electronic music. So it's actually kind of difficult for me to put that into perspective as to what else was going on with electric music at the time. I was still really into rock and metal and didn't really discover electronic music until a couple of years later. Yeah, I mean, 81, I still think it's really fair to say that these guys were, way ahead of their time.
They were pioneers. I would believe that could be the word we could use. I think that at this point, some of the mainstream pop artists were a little bit dabbling into incorporating, some electronic music, maybe via a keyboard that would have like a little bit of a sequencer to it, or even like the Fairlight or the Moog type sequencers or keyboards. They were becoming more commonly used. They weren't yet mastered, but Kraftwerk decided to go a completely different route and call it kind of a way of life, a kind of a calling, right?
Yeah, it's almost like they weren't using the instruments to emulate other instruments. They wanted to make music that sounded like they were made with computers. There was no pretense of this is replacing a string sound or a bass sound or something like that. They were they were just making their own sounds and kind of completely doing away with traditional instrumentation.
How do you feel about the cover art this time around for Kraftwerk'S Computer World?
So you got the four guys there. They are inside of a computer.
Yes.
What it makes me think is, are these guys one with the computer? Are they literally?
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that.
Is it them coming out of the computer, into the speakers and in the the airwaves, or are they the computer and the computer itself making the music?
We're getting existential now.
You can go deep with it. It's a very, very, very simple cover.
But is it?
Right. Right. And then just from an artistic aesthetic point of view too, their faces are just two colors, this yellowish and black, but they really look three-dimensional. And the art on it is really good, because just two colors, and, you can really make out their facial features. And especially back then, computers were basically two colors anyway. So to be able to create facial features like that, it's just kind of a testament to what you could do with a computer back then.
Yeah. See, when I look at the cover art, I see essentially like an Apple I or Apple II CE with the members of the band on the display of the screen of the computer with like a shadowed yellow approach. If they wanted to differentiate the members of the band, you'd be hard pressed, like pressing the execute key here on the keyboard, to know actually like what member actually did what on this album. It was very, very computer infused, just from even like the visual aspect of it. They weren't actually going for like a full visual or like a full like rock band feel on the album cover. They were like actually giving us one of those scenarios where it's like what you see is kind of what you're going to hear, you know?
Yeah.
And this was kind of different, like back in, 81 for a traditional release. For a long time, it was a lot of marketing. Like we can go back to like our Kiss episode where their marketing was like so big. This was more of like almost a diversion into the realm of like something new, something geeky, if you will, at the time. It is pretty basic, but like we talk about it here, maybe there is more deepness to it, but I do like the cover a lot. So how did you get your hands on it, or how did you get turned on to Kraftwerk, Bill?
It comes completely from hip hop and electro. I didn't know who these guys were. They were played on the radio alongside electro, like Egyptian Lover, Afrika Bambaataa, Hashim. I thought that, they were just like these other acts, recent electro. Only later would I come to find that the new electro sounds, Egyptian Lover, Planet Rock, these new sounds, they were completely inspired by Kraftwerk that had come a couple of years before them. Once I understood that, kind of took on a little bit of a deeper meaning as to just the importance of these guys. Even if you listen to like three of their songs, completely inspired and influenced, at least 5 different genres of music for the last 30 years.
Totally.
Pretty incredible. And so those 3 songs are Trans-Europe Express, which is on an earlier album, Numbers, which is on this album, and then after this, Tour de France, which came a couple years later. In my opinion, those 3 songs just open the floodgates for electro, techno, Miami bass, Florida breaks, even Latin freestyle uses the drum beats that go all the way back to, Numbers and some of the melodies from Trans-Europe Express. So
they could very well be the first actual version of what we would call, say, free loops, or maybe any kind of loops that are now in our atmosphere. Like, instead of having like loops like we have now that are readily handy, they were like the originator of that kind of thing, or the remix movement, right?
Agreed.
Because prior to them, I don't think there was really anybody that would put out a record where it was so instantaneously grabbed by other people that heard it and say, hey, you know what? I like this a lot. I like the beat. I think it's perfect. It's done so well. Maybe I can put something over it, or I can change it, just modify it a little bit. They were like, I wonder if they were ever asked about that. That would be interesting to an interview I'd like to read or hear if they ever commented on their success in that world, or being that element for so many other artists. Like, it'll be really cool to know like how they felt about that. Were they honored, or did they feel like, a different way, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know if they really completely understand the inspiration that they gave. They've been sampled, over 700 times.
Oh my gosh!
Just by different, in tons of different genres. They're like the James Brown of, electronic dance music.
That's hilarious.
I
like that, Bill.
Their influence.
I like that.
James Brown is sampled, thousands of times, and in hip hop, and so is Kraftwerk.
You have to wonder like how Afrika Bambaataa was turned on at Kraftwerk. I'd like to hear that story too. That's an interesting one.
That was one of his things. He would take anything that you could dance to and throw it in his sets. Whereas like Grandmaster Flash would play mostly funk stuff. He'd play, older funk and soul records and anything with funky drum breaks and that sort of thing. But Afrika Bambaataa, he'd play anything. He'd play the monkey.
Mm-hmm.
He played Billy Squire, that type of stuff. And then yeah, then
he had no fear. He was like, you know what? I like it. I'm going to put it out there. You guys can listen to it. I don't care. He was pretty brave, eh?
Yeah,
That's awesome.
he had an ear. He had an ear for the drum beats.
Yeah.
And so he started playing Kraftwerk, and people liked it. Then his genius, mind said, "Hey, why don't I have these guys rap on top of this record?" Who would have known that was Planet Rock, right? So who would have known how far that song would have gone as well? It's a bunch of guys from the Bronx rapping over techno from Germany. It's pretty incredible that he was able to bridge those two worlds, and it worked really, really, really well. It's amazing.
It was that time, I think, was truly such a experimental, and also just people wanting to expand and find new things. It's so different from where we are today that when you look back on it and you just read about it or we talk about it now, I just find myself like, wow, because that takes work, to seek out different records, to seek out different sounds, to seek out, what's going on overseas, and to incorporate that into like an urban sound. That was something that actually happened. That isn't occurrence. That just doesn't happen. That was something that historically is fascinating to me, and I'm sure it is to you as well. So, it's so neat.
There was no precedent for it either. It was completely unprecedented, because today people are still really creative. They do a lot of cool creative stuff with sampling, but the precedent has already been set. Afrika Bambaataa already did it. Guys are still doing really great work, but Afrika Bambaataa and those guys, they built this up from nothing. And it was unprecedented. And it's amazing to think just how all this stuff came together.
Well, it's like, back in the day, people were going to record stores and they were going through the stacks of wax, and they were looking for new stuff that was like they probably haven't heard before, and maybe possibly it was like, well, what is this about? And it's like before, streaming, listening to a streaming album or listening to what quote unquote is supposedly hot right now and being force fed, we were able to go to our local record store and go through the bins and even look at covers and be like, wow, this cover is kind of interesting. And like, what story are they, trying to tell us? Whereas now it's like, it's so very different.
And it was harder to find music back then too. And so there was also just the competition between DJs to find stuff that nobody ever heard before. And they want to be the only DJ out there with this song, so that, to set themselves apart. So clearly, Afrika Bambaataa found a lot of music that would set himself apart. Kraftwerk being, perhaps the biggest because that was, from the Planet Rock, which was, obviously his biggest hit.
It's epic, for sure. Such a historic fusion of both Kraftwerk and Afrika Bambaataa. Pretty awesome. So, Computer World is the 8th studio album by German electronic band Kraftwerk, released on May 10th in 1981. The album peaked at number 15 on the UK albums chart. It was certified silver by the British phonography industry on the 12th of February in 1982 for shipments in excess of 60,000 copies. The singles from Computer World were Pocket Calculator, Computer Love, Computer Wealth, and Numbers. So the way you got turned on to the album was essentially through Afrika Bambaataa. Is that kind of what you're saying? How did you find out that Afrika Bambaataa sampled that? Was it like in the album credits for?
I wouldn't realize that for a little while. When I kind of put together that Trans Europe Express, that melody sounded a lot like what was in Planet Rock. They're at two really different tempos, but once I kind of recognized that melody, I kind of put that together, and then the beat from Numbers. That's the Planet Rock beat right there. But because I discovered both of these acts at the same time, I was turned on to Planet Rock and Afrika Bambaataa at the same time as Kraftwerk because they were being played on the radio alongside each other. because they were both electro. So I just kind of lumped Kraftwerk. I didn't even know they were Kraftwerk. I didn't even know the name of the group at all. They were they were another part of the mix, which was, included Egyptian Lover and, Planet Rock and Hashim and other electronic dance stuff.
So essentially, when you first heard Planet Rock, you didn't know that Kraftwerk was actually probably 50% responsible for that track, right?
When I first heard Planet Rock, I didn't realize that it was borrowed from Kraftwerk. I didn't know who came first, so I didn't know who was influenced by who. I wouldn't really learn that till a couple of years later, after I really understood, who Kraftwerk were, and actually got to, listen to some of their albums and that sort of thing. So no, I really wasn't aware, just the impact and influence that Kraftwerk had on these other electro groups, which, if you go back and listen to them, the electro from LA in 83, 84, 85, they're pretty much blatant Kraftwerk ripoffs. It's pretty funny. It's really interesting. But hey, that's how music progresses. That's the evolution of music.
I think the best way to look at it was like one of the comments I made earlier, is that because of their meticulousness and the roboticness of the beats that were awesomely super tight, but also very organic and very meticulously crafted. And also their records and especially like Numbers, they didn't have a lot of vocals on it. So that's equal opportunity back in those days to just, use it to rap over, And because of that fact, a lot of people used it. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people thought that it was, it almost it became kind of like a grounds for just a regular beat. Like, hey, check out this beat. It's Kraftwerk. Like it was almost like a new normal. It started to become that in certain scenes. So, and we have Kraftwerk to thank for that. And it's pretty awesome that they were around to give that to everyone in the world. I'm very thankful for it. I think it's pretty awesome. So
I think in LA too, with that, with the electro that was going on in 83 and 84, Kraftwerk obviously, was robotic. That was actually part of their image, at different points in their careers was being robots. And so actually that was taken up by dancers in LA who did the robot. In fact,
very cool.
Their song Tour de France is featured in the movie Breakin'.
Good point.
Turbo's doing the robot to Kraftwerk. So I think, that played a big part of their popularity among, poppers and lockers in LA and breakers. I think a lot of people into dance took to Kraftwerk.
I have to think though that, and this is one of the points I wanted to make too during this discussion, is that, we're talking about 1981 and 1982, like the producers and all the guys in Kraftwerk that were making this at this point. It's just a Class A production in my head. It's like, it's electronic music, but it's like, it's got such organic feels to it that, like I can't even like try and replicate that when I'm trying to make music on my own. Even like a Trent Reznor, to make his music sound more organic, he needs like a live bassist, a live guitarist. Whereas Kraftwerk was able to do something that was actually organic, and then when people added to it, it became even more organic, and the flow became even stronger. But at the core of it, when I listen to it even now, I'm amazed when I hear it. Like, I'm like, yes, this is computer music, but it's not boring. It's not stagnant. It's not like a bunch of bleeps and boops. It's very moving and for the ear, it moves really, really well, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And for something to be done that way in a 1981, you just have to think about the meticulousness that it took to actually give a computer, a swing almost, if you will.
You bring up a great point about it being organic and having a bit of a swing to it because that's absolutely right. They were robotic in a lot of sense, but they also brought feeling to it, like you mentioned, organic. Even the sounds had a lot of warmth to them, as opposed to being completely icy. Not all the songs are completely icy or completely precise. They do play around with using different space between the notes. I wonder if a lot of that has to do with because they began their career as a band using conventional acoustic instruments. In fact, Florian Schneider, he played the flute. So they were already familiar with timing that added feel to it as opposed to being completely on the beat. In, for instance, Numbers, the kick drum isn't placed in the traditional electronic music sense. Typically, electronic dance music has the kick drum on the 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's nicknamed 4 on the floor for that reason. Rock was typically you had the kick drum on 1 and 3. In a song like Numbers, you have that second kick drum somewhere in between 2 and 3. And it does add a swing to it because in between that space, it just adds some feeling to it. For instance, when you think of drummers, what sets a lot of drummers apart is just the really tiny sort of offbeat imprecision, if you will, by a technical definition, just that imprecision that really brings a feel to it. And it really set apart a lot of drummers from others. The first example that comes to my mind is John Bonham, just how, he didn't play robotic. He did have a feel to it by being slightly imprecise. And I do wonder if with Kraftwerk, a lot of that may be because they did play some of their songs and some of their song parts manually. It wasn't all sequenced. Yeah, great point. Exactly. Organic. A lot of the other electronic music was just military precision. And Kraftwerk does offer a little more of a human essence to the computerized music.
So, Bill, what's your favorite tunes on the album, and how do you feel about them?
Well, so I have 3, really. Can I have 3? Yeah, so Numbers.
We'll give you 3, baby.
Yeah. Numbers is in a league of its own, but
absolutely.
Home Computer and It's More Fun to Compute. Really love those 2 songs. You've heard those sampled hundreds of times as well. Just classic stuff. And they actually mix very well together too. You can layer them on top of each other, and they just sound outstanding.
Cool. My favorite tune off this particular album by Kraftwerk is going to be Computer Love. I almost feel like they were electro Nostradamuses when they were writing this tune. They may have predicted online dating, perhaps Instagram, or even the unholy Snapchat at this point. They only missed the if you like me, or if you don't, swipe up or give me a like, hit the subscribe button, punch that button or whatever. I mean, this was the 80s, and they were basically prophesizing what perhaps computer love was going to be for the next 30 years. I was very impressed when I heard that. I was like, wow.
They called it.
Yeah, they weren't the, obviously they weren't the only ones to try and adopt some kind of vision of the future. But when I heard it, I was like, this is awesome. And obviously I'm very much a big fan of Numbers. I was just listening to it, and I was like, well, where's the
right.
It's so funny to hear it, like when it's kind of like stripped down, but that it's been used so often. And that it's funny when you listen to it, you can hear all this stuff going around with the panning, like left and right. It's not just a simple stereo track. Like they must have spent a long time like figuring out, like, I want this lip to go to the left side. So just very impressive all around. So those are my 2 favorite tracks.
Yeah, so you mentioned Computer Love kind of predicting the future. Computer World is really kind of eerie too, with predicting the future. So the lyrics on it are business, numbers, money, people. Right. So kind of crazy, because back then, right, computers are used for business, right? Numbers, obviously.
Yep.
money, and then people. So it's kind of like, are they prophesizing not only social media but just surveillance and that sort of thing. So that was
they were Sears, Bill.
Yes.
Electro Domuses.
They could see the future. And then to keep on with just the computer music theme, the song Pocket Calculator, he talks about making a melody with his pocket calculator. So the vocals used in Numbers apparently was from a Texas Instrument machine called the Language Translator from 1978. Oh my
gosh.
So
it's almost like a speak and spell or something.
Exactly.
Wow.
It used the same chip that went on to power the Speak and Spell.
Oh my God, that is way stellar. This is great. Love it. These guys were not kidding around about being computer geeks a little bit. So rad. That's so cool, man. I had no idea. That's a great fact. That's a good one.
Yeah, and these guys were perfectionists in the studio too. I also read that
you can tell.
They're absolutely perfectionists. One of the things that some of the guys didn't really want to do was they're kind of reluctant to go on tour because they didn't want to be away from their work. So they packed up their studio basically and toured with their studio so that they could do
insane.
Exactly. They could do shows, come back and write, program stuff. They always wanted to be working, and they looked at it at the studio as kind of a laboratory. If it wasn't correct, it wasn't correct, and they kept going until they felt that it was correct. Is how one of them used it.
Cool.
And they did this before MIDI. Before MIDI came out.
Yeah, I was gonna get into that. I was gonna ask about that, because MIDI obviously was such a breakthrough for audio recording because it was an interface for us to have all our machines talk together, right? So, like you just said, this was prior to that, which is, wow, that's pretty mind-blowing within itself. Not relying on machine language that would come out later, and them just relying on essentially a computer for, sounds and beats per minute. And who's to say they even, listened to the music in that format, like a beats per minute, format. Maybe they just created. MIDI was always such an interesting thing because it made the machines talk together, but it also gave us a beats per minute and let everything chain together fluidly, or somewhat fluidly. So if they were working with that prior to MIDI, oh my gosh, wow, that's just amazing to me.
Right. So for this album, it was either played by hand or they did use early analog sequencers. They had a 16-step sequencer. If you can picture the 808, the 16-step sequencer that you have in that, they had machines that were similar to that. But again, this album came out a few years before MIDI. So they were pioneers that way in that way as well. They didn't have all the tools that people would a couple of years later.
So cool. Wow. Pioneers indeed. Awesome. So I think we should give a homage or a tribute to Florian Schneider at this point. Thank you so much for everything you've done for electronic music. Bill and I are both huge fans. God bless you. May you rest in peace.
Absolutely. Your influence and spirit lives on with all the musicians and everybody that you've touched with your music.
You know it. So I guess I'll just say one last thing regarding the Kraftwerk and the Front 242 connection, because I'm more of a Front 242 fan than a Kraftwerk fan. But I have to tell you, when I listen to this album, I'm honestly floored. I love it when I listen to it, and it's one of those albums that you can listen to, and it's kind of short, but it's just through and through. You can actually put it on and listen to it, and you're not going to actually fast forward through it. It's a pretty awesome album. It's very much all killer, no filler.
the flow was really good too. And
It is.
I think it probably went on to influence DJ sets too, because they have songs with, that will have an element of multiple songs. So it's almost like they're mixing their own album as a DJ would.
The innovation, whether they were trying to do it or not, whether they were trying to be pioneers or not, of what was going to actually eventually happen to their recordings, I probably would wager they had no idea. But man, what an effect on the world that this album had. So it's truly historic.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening in to another episode of Talkin' Records, where we covered Kraftwerk's groundbreaking album, Computer World. You can reach us at vitalcastpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much. Hope you're being safe, and God bless.
Put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record, put the needle on the record and dance with me.
Talkin' records. Talkin' records. Talkin' records. That's right.